marriage is a stepping stone to a relationship with Christ. This union, while it is of great, great importance in this world, eternally pales in comparison to the importance of our relationship with Christ. But God has so designed it that if you both pursue Christ ardently together, that will make your marriage what it should be. That's of greater importance than the compatibility of your personalities, than of your shared interests, even of your physical attraction to each other, none of which are trivial things. But pursuing Christ together, that is the way to have a healthy marriage. Hello, and welcome back to the Innerfire Podcast. We're glad you're with us today. This is part 1 of our 2-part series on marriage. And what we're going to be talking about today is what biblical marriage is and what biblical marriage is not. And it is pretty clear the deeper you dig in to biblical marriage, how far our society has strayed from that. So I think that will become very clear as we go through the particulars of God's perfect design for marriage. So let's get started.
Yeah, let's do it, Andrew. As we have prepared for this podcast, I'm going to be honest, I have been somewhat floored as I've really delved into the state of marriage in our country, the state of marriage inside the church. It makes me tremble for where we're headed with the church, for where we're headed in this culture. If this is an issue that if the church does not fix, if the church doesn't stand up and make its voice known, we're headed for we already see it, but we're headed for even worse conditions than we are. Mm-hmm. And marriage is so foundational, not only to the culture, but to the church itself. We've just let this get completely out of control. There's a lack of understanding. Obviously, there's a lack of knowledge of what the implications are for this. And so I hope we can dig into some of that and make people sit up and take notice and say, hey, I need to be doing something to promote marriage. The first thing they need to be doing is living it out. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what we're about, is living out the word. Mm-hmm. They need to live out the word in their own marriages as an example to those around about them. So we'll dig into this and see more as we go forward.
So you say that marriage is in a mess, and I want to furnish that statement with a little bit of data. And these are some state statistics. In 1965, over 80% of 25 to 34-year-olds were married. Today, that percentage is less than 50. Now, how do we account for that? Part of it, I'm sure, is people getting married later in life, but still, the average is well below 34. People are bowing out of marriage. Fewer people are getting married. Of course, we know that the retention rate for marriage is not what it should be either. 85% of American adults say that cohabitation is acceptable. 85%. That means that in a given room that has 10 people in it, approximately 9 of them think that cohabitation is acceptable.
Yeah, let's just stop there on that statistic. And we'll talk about cohabitation as we go along, I'm sure. But no other statistic that I ran across in doing the research hit me harder than that statistic. Because that statistic alone says marriage is not valued in our culture. Mm-hmm. You know, we do not understand the implications of doing away with marriage. I mean, we do not realize, I don't think, how close we are in this culture to marriage not even being a thing. Mm-hmm. You know, marriage as it has been known historically. Mm-hmm. There may be some, some lip service given to, they got married, but from a standpoint of how our government treats it, how the average person treats it, we're right on the verge of marriage not even existing. And I know that sounds dramatic, but when 85% of people basically say, yeah, cohabitation is fine. What they're really saying is there's no value in marriage.
Right.
There's no benefit in marriage. You know, why would we embrace something if we felt like it was backwards and wrong and hurtful and harmful? I mean, you know, do 85% of Americans think it's okay to get drunk and get in a car and drive? No, they don't. Why do they think it's okay to cohabitate before marriage? I mean, people say, "Oh, well, you're equating two things that are not equal." Well, I would disagree with them on that because there are just so many implications here that go so far beyond, I want a relationship and this is the way I'm going to do it and it doesn't affect anybody else. And it's troubling to me.
Yeah. Well, that's a very telling statistic. Let me go on. Age 25 to 34, once again, for the first time in U.S. history, the percentage of that group who have not been married exceeds those that have. Just 20 years ago, the number there was a 20% gap in favor of marriage. There are many other statistics on marriage. I think it's common knowledge at this point that about half of marriages end in divorce, which is very sobering, which is very sad. That should not be. But to make matters worse, it doesn't appear that that number is incredibly different within the walls of the church. So,
well, all those statistics, Andrew, I mean, you just pick a statistic. We've cherry picked a few here. But if you look at the statistics and just anecdotal evidence around our own selves, it's very evident to see that marriage is on a steep negative decline, and it's something that the church should be very concerned about. And what we're going to talk about is, what is God's view of marriage? What is His plan for marriage? We'll have a follow-on podcast to this to talk about, how to deal with some of the problems in marriage. But today we just want to deal with, why is marriage important? Why have we come to this view as a society and even as a church in a lot of cases that just says, there's no value in marriage? Right. That's what we want to dig into.
Right. We could sit here and try to parse out all of the different social and economic factors that play into the decline of marriage. And indeed, people have done that. But in my mind, it's very simple. It is a departure from God's design and a departure from the authority of God in the heart and mind of the individual and then the culture at large. So we have got to rediscover that design. And I'll just say, before we dive into the scriptures, God's design for marriage is so deep and so interwoven throughout all of Scripture and so revelatory of our creation in the image of God that it's hard to even know the order in which to present the facts. But we're going to do the best that we can.
We're going to try. But before we get into that foundational design and all those intricate elements of how marriage fits into the Bible, let me just say the root problem in this whole issue is sin. It is people thumbing their nose at God's design and saying, we don't need you, God. We'll figure this out on our own. And if we look at so many of our cultural problems, so many of the problems even inside the church, they can come back and be laid at the feet of not treating marriage correctly. The damage just goes so far. And so that's why this is such an important issue. But let's not just, like, as you said, we can parse all the cultural reasons for it. There's one base reason. That is, we don't want to do what God said. We're a nihilistic bunch that wants to do exactly what we want to do and experience the things we want to experience. I mean, let's just say it like it is. The sexual revolution and making it okay to have marriage sex outside the marital bonds is where this problem started to a large extent. And that whole misconstruing of what we were created for from a sexual standpoint, how that all works was really part of the what started this problem, and it's still what's continuing this problem. And so I'm sure we'll deal with that at some point in time as far as what God's design is. But it's just like I said, it's the issue is troubling to me. I know it's probably coming across in how what I'm saying about this, but it really is troubling because y'all are coming up in this culture. I've got 3 grandkids and another on the way. What are they going to have to deal with? How is even society and the church going to deal with them on this issue? Are they going to get the right information?
Yeah.
If you look at Micah 4:6, basically he was saying that my people perish for lack of knowledge. And that verse to me plays into this issue because people don't understand what they're doing. Now, where did that lack of knowledge, where did that blame fall?
Right.
That blame fell squarely on the priest. And if you read that passage, that whole passage, basically Michael was prophesying and God was speaking directly to him and basically saying, priest, you're going to be held accountable for this. And what I'm saying from that verse is that church, you're going to be held accountable for this. This goes beyond, just placing the blame on the non-church in the culture. The blame is going to be at the feet of pastors, preachers, and church members who have not stood up and said, this is God's design and this is what we need to be doing. We have got to be more proactive on this issue. We can't pass over it. We can't turn a blind eye. We have got to engage and speak the truth on this issue.
Amen. Amen.
So what is God's design? Let's get into it.
Well, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning.
Absolutely.
When man was created and then woman. Genesis 2:18 says, Then the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper. I will make him a helper fit for him. And I think we could probably make the rest of the podcast about this one verse. First of all, it's not good that man should be alone. So what is God saying? I've created a social creature here. He needs someone else who's like him. A pet dog is not going to do. He needs flesh of his flesh, bone of his bone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Okay, that helper fit for him is translated a few different ways. Some people translate it helpmeet. Some people translate it a helper suitable for him. If you go back to the Hebrew, basically what it means is you have ezer, that's the helper word, and then kenegdo, which is the word generally translated suitable. But basically what that word implies is a helper against him, a helper opposite to him, a helper counter to him. This is man and this is his partner. This is man and this is his partner. And not only, and you will see this more as we go through this, not only is woman presented as necessarily complementary to man, which has all kinds of implications for the way the marriage should be conducted, but also right at the outset, homosexual marriage is off the table. It doesn't work. It was never designed to be that way. God did not make another man for Adam because that is not what Adam needed. He needed a helper suitable for him, a counterpart. The other thing that implies is that it is in the oppositeness, the againstness, that the beauty of the marriage relationship is found. That is to say, you're not supposed to be like your wife. And if you're a woman, you're not supposed to be like your husband. There's this positive adversity that happens between the two that balances them out and brings them into a fuller mode of being for having been united with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I want to just interject before I address specifically what you're talking about there, because I do have something to say about that. Let me just say, if there are people who are single, maybe been single their whole lives, we're not in any way here making you a lesser person or saying that singleness is not an option. What we are talking about is when two people decide that they want to come together and be life partners, that should be in marriage, and that's what we're discussing. We will probably get into singleness a little bit because Paul does deal directly with that, and there is a place for that. Mm-hmm. We're not in any way lessening people who choose that path. But back to your point of the complementary nature of marriage, this was designed by God. And this is what I was saying earlier. We have thumbed our nose at God's design. And in my view, this is like trying to use a pair of pliers to drive a nail. A pair of pliers was not designed to drive a nail. Mm-hmm. Can you drive a nail with it? You can, if the wood is soft enough and the nail is small enough and the pliers are big enough, you can make it work. But if you really need to drive a big nail and the wood is hard, you need a tool that was designed for that purpose, and there is no substitute for a hammer. Mm-hmm. And what we are trying to do in this culture is take a pair of pliers to marriage and apply our ideals to it when really we've got the wrong tool. Marriage is the tool designed by God with a very specific purpose, not only in how that marriage works, how we function as people, as human beings, procreation, raising children, all these different issues. But we've got to acknowledge that this is the best way, and it was intentionally designed, not only practically, but symbolically of the larger relationship of Jesus and the church and different things like that. So, yes, there is a very specific design. We need to embrace the design, not rail against it. Mm-hmm. It's like me sitting here arguing with you, saying, I got this pair of pliers, Andrew. I can drive this nail. And you've got like a hammer saying, why don't you use this? This is mm-hmm. This was designed for that purpose. And me just sitting here saying, I don't need your hammer. Take mm-hmm. your hammer away. I'll sit here and labor with this pair of pliers until I bend this nail over or do some damage. It's really that kind of an issue.
Well, I actually think it's worse than that. I think that it started out that way.
Yeah.
It started out trying to replace the hammer with something else. Now I think we live in a society that's asking the question, why do we need to drive a nail? Or why can't you drive a hammer with a nail?
Yeah, it's about that bad, yeah.
But more so, why do we even need to drive the nail? At least in the early days, the LGBT movement said, we want to keep marriage basically as it was, just replace the man with a woman, or replace the woman with a man. But what they did when they did that was they said, okay, the metaphysical basis, we're going to get rid of that because that's in our way. And then they failed to replace it. So now the foundation is gone, and the basis for driving a nail to begin with is not even there. Mm-hmm. And I think this is part of the reason that people are bowing out of marriage. And I think that this is part of the reason that sexuality and even something as fundamental as gender are both in complete chaos. Each of them, the very conception of them, hanging on by a thread in our culture.
Well, as soon as we get rid of God out of the equation, which is what we've done, we've tossed God in the ditch and walked away from him. When we do that, we become unhinged. When we forget that we were created in God's image for a specific person with a specific design, as soon as we throw that away, it is chaos. There is no foundation. And until we get back to that, we're not going to find another foundation. There is no other foundation other than that. Mm-hmm. Everything else we do is building a house of cards or a house on the sand. And the first wind, the first rain, it's going to collapse. It's going to fall down. And so I totally agree. We have to get back to God's design there in Genesis.
Right. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And people read that and say, oh, I know what that means. One flesh, that means they're going to have sex with each other. It means, yes, it means that, but it means so much more than that. Now, this union is a part of man's creation in the image of God. This is actually shown twice in Genesis. When God says he made man in his image, he follows that statement up directly with male and female. He created them, which sort of softly implies that man's creation as male and female represents God's image. Now, people will take that and try to make it say that God is female. We don't have to get into all of that. But there are some interesting things to be gleaned. For one, you can see, and I bring these up not just because they're interesting, but because they deepen the ideas that we're talking about right now. Take the Trinity. The Trinity is three distinct persons united into one. So you can see with marriage, there's two distinct persons united into one. Now, the thing about the Trinity is the Trinity is God. And they're all equal, because how could God not be equal with himself? It wouldn't make any sense. However, the Father has headship over the Son. So you see equality coexisting with a difference in authority. And this is something that the feminists have the hardest time wrapping their head around. The idea that someone can be in authority, can have headship, and that not somehow imply superiority and inferiority. So that is a point about the Trinity. But I think it also shows how deep the one flesh bond is. Similarly, Christ and the church. This one is made a little bit more explicit in the scripture in Ephesians 5, which we can read later. I think that this metaphor is so deep that it's impossible to properly understand marriage or properly understand one's relationship with Christ without making it. In this metaphor, Christ represents the husband and the church represents the bride. So there you also have the authority issue going, but then you also begin to see the different roles that the two play. The man being the one that loves, that leads self-sacrificially, that leads in the form of a servant, and the wife being the one that honors, that submits, that, what else?
Well, I think just if you look at that in general, there shouldn't be an issue there. To me, again, we have to go back to it being God's design. What people have done is they've twisted this, and they have tried to make it such that because the man is given the headship, that he is given the responsibility, that somehow that implies more value.
Right.
And we're not speaking of value, we're speaking of equality. And this baffles me why anybody can say that men and women are equal. They're not. I mean, just from a pure physical makeup, they are not the same. Right. They have different physical characteristics. Are there some women that are stronger than some men? Yes. But taken as a whole, men are stronger. We're designed differently from a sexual standpoint. How can those two things be equal? They cannot.
Yeah.
That's like saying this pair of pliers is exactly equal to this hammer. No, they're not. They're designed for different things. Look at them. They're shaped differently. They move differently. They're different. If we would just acknowledge that, then we could get to the point of looking at, okay, now that we acknowledge that there are differences, how do those differences come together to create something better than they would be individually? It's the old 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. In the state of marriage, I think it's more like 2 + 2 = 10. It is so much better. I've been married for over 30 years. I have experienced a lot of different things in marriage. I have experienced great days, and quite honestly, I've experienced days where I'm ready to pack up my stuff and leave. If you live with somebody for 30 years, maybe somebody has the perfect marriage, but I think those are extremely rare commodities. But we can even talk about what a perfect marriage is. But the fact that you're going to butt heads sometimes, that you're going to have issues, yes, but it's because you are different people. But you have to understand that you have been put together. Those differences should come together to make you better. All those struggles that we've had have turned me into a better person. I would not be, in any form or fashion, the person I am today without Jonna being my counterpart.
Right.
She hasn't cowered in the corner as we've gone through our marriage. She's done exactly what you said. She is my opposer.
Right.
She says, do you really want to do that? Do you understand what's going to happen? Do you see what you're doing there? It's a constant advising of me.
Yes.
It's a constant revealing to me because she sees things that I do not see. I highly value that. On the other hand, I see things that she doesn't see. And hopefully she values that. The fact that the man is headship, all that really means is at the end of the day, I bear the responsibility. And, if you want to put it in spiritual terms, when we stand before God one day, I'm the one that's going to have to give an account of what has happened in this marriage from a spiritual standpoint. And so, the weight is on me. And if you just look at the scripture, when it says that a man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church, I would say that is a more difficult assignment even than is given to the wife. How high of a standard is that? That, to love her like Christ loved the church, that's a pretty doggone high standard. And so men are not getting a free pass here is what I'm saying. They're getting their fair share of the burden. And if men and women will just work together, it'll be better than being alone.
Right. That word equality is sticky. Equality along what dimension? We've just got to get more precise about this,
Yep.
Well, I don't believe in, submission because men and women are equal. Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that they're the same? As you've already pointed out, that's clearly absurd.
Yes.
I like the way Wayne Grudem puts it. Equal in personhood and importance. Their spiritual status, their ontological status before God is equal. And we see that made explicit in the New Testament. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female in Christ. We're all the same before God. But to then say that basically those differences between men and women no longer exist, well, that would be just as absurd as saying that once the new covenant was established, Jews ceased to exist, that all the slaves were released. No, these are still realities here in the physical world. They're just not eternal realities. So you also brought up once again that complementary positive adversity that exists in the marriage relationship. let me just say on that front, if you have the perfect marriage and you and your wife never fight, you need to check up.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a perfect marriage. If your marriage is like this, that's not the way it's meant to be. Now, if you fight too much, if there's too much contrariness, then that's also not helpful. But if there is never any conflict, then you both are not being refined. You're not being sharpened, and you're not being balanced out. And this is something
you're not growing in holiness.
Yeah.
You know, the point is in marriage is, you know, not just to be happy, but to be holy. You know, God has given those that are married a partner to help them increase in holiness, to get closer to Christ, to be a better servant of Christ, a better follower of Christ, a better Christian. And that's what that relationship should be doing. And when somebody gets in our knickers and says, you're not being very Christ-like right now,
mm-hmm.
we don't like it. And that does create tension, and it does create conflict. But we better have somebody in our life that does that. And the best person is our spouse.
Absolutely.
Because left to our own devices, we will come off the rails. And I'll speak directly to the men. If you haven't given your wife permission, I mean, if you rail on her when she calls out your deficiencies, then you need to change. I mean, you need to listen to what your wife is saying, and she needs to be empowered to tell you these things, because it will make you a better person. You know, my experience is that my wife oftentimes is much more tuned in spiritually than I am. I can tell you, she is much more committed, even, you know, to prayer and things like that than I have been throughout the course of our marriage. And so should I neglect that? Should I turn a deaf ear to that? Absolutely not. She's the one who's constantly reminding me of the importance of these things. That doesn't mean that I'm not the spiritual head of the household, because there have been plenty of times when I said, this is what we need to do. But we must listen to one another. We must embrace that tension that you're talking about, because that is how we move forward. Again, not just in living, in living a happier life, but being more holy as people. And let me just say this too, on the whole equal thing. When you got two people that enter into any kind of a relationship, whether it's a marriage or a business partnership, or whether or not you're getting together to do anything, if there's not a way to resolve the differences when an impasse is reached, then you're headed for trouble. But so, you know, because, you know, you're going to have conflict and you're going to have an impasse all along.
Sure.
So how does that get resolved? Well, God's design is to say, I'm making the man responsible for resolving that. The wife must heed that when an impasse is reached. That doesn't mean her voice is not heard. That doesn't mean that, you know, she doesn't get to state her view. You know, in business, which I have a business, I do not want to surround myself with yes men, with people who view everything just like me. I want the leaders that are around me to be critical, to give me advice, to say, do you really want to run out on that limb? And, you know, the way it works in business is those people come to me and they say, do you really want to do this? Have you thought about this? We discuss it. We don't always agree. They understand at the end of the day, I am responsible. I have to make the decision, and they follow that. It's the same way in marriage. It doesn't lessen the voice of the wife or the female in the relationship, but when you come to an impasse, there has to be a final decision maker, and God has just decided that should be the man.
Right, right. And men, that should be a very sobering word in your ears. In a family, there's a hierarchy of authority. The kids have some responsibility for how things go in the family, but not that much, especially depending on how old they are. The mother and father bear more responsibility, and that's very plain to everyone. You see a kid screaming in the grocery store, what do you think? Oh, what a horrible kid. No, you think, oh, what a horrible parent, right? Because you recognize that the parent has some responsibility because the parent is the one in the authority. But the husband, the father, has responsibility over even the wife. So if things are not going the way you want to with your wife, if you're not pleased with the way that she's behaving, you need to look right in the mirror, because God is going to hold you accountable for that. Now, everyone will be held to the standard that is just for them. I'm not saying that wives have no autonomy, that they will not be also held responsible for their actions. But with that authority comes the burden of leadership. And sometimes, I'll tell Courtney when we're faced with a difficult decision, I'll tell Courtney, like, hey, I know this is hard, but you have to trust me with this. And if this goes wrong, before God, I will bear the responsibility for it, not you. Mm-hmm. And when you start talking that way, you're going to think a lot harder about your decisions. And the other thing is, like, anything can be overdone. This is not a situation where it's like, where do you want to go for dinner tonight? Well, I want to go to the Mexican place. Well, I want to go to the Italian place. We've reached an impasse. I guess we've got to go to the place I want to. No, you need to talk about decisions where you don't disagree thoroughly. You need to have those disagreements. You need to work them out verbally. You need to do everything you can to come to a point of agreement. I'll let you go. Say what you were going to say from there.
Well, yeah, and it doesn't, from the speaking to the man again, it doesn't need to be just man's opinion. You need to have a biblical reason for what you're doing. Mm-hmm. I do think, to what you said, both the husband and the wife, when things are not going well in the marriage, they need to look in the mirror. They don't need to point a finger at the other. They need to begin by looking in the mirror and seeing what they need to do. Mm-hmm. I'll give a shout out to a mentor I have, Dewey Green. When Jonna and I were butting heads over a particular issue and having some struggles, I was talking to Dewey about it, and he told me this, with some of the most striking advice that I have ever received as a husband, and it landed heavy on me, and I've thought about it ever since, and I pray that every husband listening to this will think about it. You have been put in the place with your wife to show your wife what God's love looks like. You are here. God's not here in the physical. You are here in the physical. And basically what Dewey told me is, Scotty, you need to love Jonna in the same way that God loves Jonna. You need to show her what that love looks like. That's a heavy thing.
Yes.
When we realize, hey, God's not going to come down. Jesus has been here in the physical, right? But he's not going to come back in the physical and today until it's time to rapture the church. But he's not going to come here and do this thing for me. Mm-hmm. I am here to show Jonna the love of God. And, if my actions are doing anything other than that, then I need to evaluate, my spiritual position and what I'm really trying to accomplish.
Right. And I absolutely agree with what Dewey has said there. And where is that truth more apparent than in the metaphor of Christ and the church?
Absolutely.
And when a couple is abiding by God's design, if the man is living in the imitation of Christ, in the fullest sense, then there will literally be no difference between the wife's submission to Christ and the wife's submission to her husband.
Mm-hmm.
Men, do you want your wives to submit to you? Lead them like Christ leads them. This is part of the reason that submission has fallen so far out of style these days, because men have not represented it properly with godly, self-sacrificial leadership. If a man's job is to love his wife with the love of God, well, what did that mean when Christ came to the earth? It meant dying on a cross. You have to be willing to die for your wife and your family. You have to be willing to bear the weight of their burdens along with your own.
Absolutely. And I think what we're talking about here and how this relationship works, I think we need to understand that properly and to understand how that from a practical standpoint is going to work and how it's going to play out. I think we have to go back to the design that God laid out and where we're reading before. To me, it's very clear if you read the scripture, and maybe we'll go through some of those if we think it's productive, but God's design for marriage was one man and one woman for life. Mm-hmm. For life. You know, we have somehow made our marriage ceremony a show, a production. We have turned it into a lot of things other than what it really is, which is a man and a woman standing before God, their family, their friends, and making a commitment to be in that marriage for life. You know, most marriage vows, at least historically, have said, until death do us part.
Yes.
And when we don't need to undervalue that commitment that we're making, because when we get in these situations that call for the type of action that we've been discussing, those are rooted in the idea that I am not going to leave this relationship. I am here for better or for worse. And so I better try to make it better. You know, I need to apply myself. And when we give ourselves an out, we as humans will take it.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we will take what appears to be the easier route, even though it's not. You know, the enemy that we have, Satan, is very good at painting a picture that says if you'll just, you know, take the exit ramp here, it'll lead to a better life. No, it won't. You know, we have got to get in this thing for the long haul, and it will cause us to do this that you're talking about. Deal with the tension. If we're not in it for the long haul, then we're not going to embrace that tension.
Right.
You know, I think that's part of the reason why cohabitation is absolutely against God's design. And I think it's a dearth on our society and even in the church. But, you know, one thing I will say that John and I have done, I believe, correctly. We agreed right from the onset of our marriage, there was a word that would never be used. It doesn't matter how dark the argument got, how deep it went, how foul it was, divorce was never a word that was allowed to be used in our house. You know, we never said, if you don't stop doing this, I'm going to file for divorce. Mm-hmm. Those words have never been uttered. And I can tell you, you know, I say it in a sense of transparency. We've had some major conflicts. It's not like there were not times where if that had been an option, somebody would have thrown out that threat, because that's a threat that people do. But we both acknowledged early on, we're not even going to entertain the idea. You're not even going to go there. And what that means is I've got to make the best of this. And I have got to stop long enough to understand your point, because you're probably trying to tell me something that's valid. And you need to do the same because I probably have got a point that's valid. But when we don't understand that we have bound ourselves together, this goes back to the one flesh. Separating would essentially be cutting a person in half. We are literally, I say literally, we're not literally one flesh. We don't become Siamese twins, but in effect, that is what has happened. We have melded together into one person. The psychological, emotional implications of splitting that go way deeper, I think, than any of us want to acknowledge. And so we just don't need to go there. That's it. We don't need to go there.
Right. Well, we're talking about divorce now. The Lord hates divorce. For the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless. That's Micah 2:16. In the New Testament now, I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. That's reiterated in Matthew 19, as well as in 5. 1 Corinthians, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. This is Paul speaking. The wife should not separate from her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. If you take seriously the fact that a man and a woman are one flesh, then you do recognize divorce being analogous to the severing of a limb. Now, look, sometimes limbs have to be severed. Sometimes you have to have an amputation. But any physician that is worth his salt will not do that until it is the absolute only option.
And you live the rest of your life with a scar.
Of course, you're never the same. Oh, and people go around having sexual unions with as many people as they can find, and we are surprised at how broken they are. Mm-hmm. They have given pieces of themselves to so many different people. It was not meant to be that way.
No.
But like I say, just like amputation, sometimes it's necessary. And the Lord has given us some guidance on that. Divorce is permissible in the case of adultery, for example. That is made explicit. Here's what I'll say, though. We humans, we're so faithless that as soon as a door is opened, we'll walk through it as quickly as we can. In spite of our faithlessness to God, He has not abandoned us. And if you want to know more about that, then you need to look no farther than the book of Hosea, right? Mm-hmm. Hosea, painting a picture of God's faithfulness, married a prostitute. That is what Israel was like. That is what we are like to God. Mm-hmm. The language of adultery being used to describe idolatry is rife throughout the Bible. But God has stuck with us. Just because your spouse commits adultery, and I will say, in the last year or 2 years, I have been surprised having learned how common affairs are. I had no idea. It's common. Once again, even within the church, the marriage can be saved through grace, through mercy, through a God-like sort of love, which can only be manifested through the power of the Spirit.
Yeah, I think God has given us the example, as you have already noted. I mean, if you just look at the nation of Israel and Hosea and a lot of other places, Israel prostituted itself to a lot of other gods, to a lot of other pleasures, to a lot of other things other than God. And let's be clear, there were consequences for that. There are outcomes
Absolutely.
that come from that. But God did not desert Israel. He did not throw them away. He did not give up on them, which is, again, another picture of how we should treat our spouses. We should not give up on them. Has there been a provision made? Yes. That doesn't mean that we have to take it if we get into that situation. Let me say this. You mentioned earlier, 50% of marriages end in divorce inside the church and outside the church. What does that mean? That means that there are a tremendous amount of divorced people sitting in our church on any given Sunday. Tremendous number. What I would say is, if you're already divorced, God is gracious. You can move forward. You can live a good life, but that doesn't change the fact that's not what the intent of marriage was. Maybe you made a horrible decision in who you picked. Maybe you married an adulterer. Maybe you married an abuser. There are reasons to separate yourself, I'm going to say, from some circumstances. So I'm not saying that you should live in an abusive relationship. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that God's intent is that divorce does not happen. Mm-hmm. And before you stand before the altar and make a commitment before God and people that you are going to live your entire life with this person, make sure that the other person understands that you expect that commitment to be reciprocated and that they are as committed to God as you are. Mm-hmm. When somebody who is a Christ follower joins themselves to an unbeliever, they're being unequally yoked. That is headed for trouble because you don't have that common basis to resolve the issues. You got one person that's not embracing anything of what we're talking about, while the other person is trying to embrace it. It's not going to work. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so we need to find spouses that are, first of all, committed to be Christ followers. I've always said you could take two Christ followers that, didn't, quote unquote, love each other or didn't really have a tendency to be married, but you could put them together in marriage and they could make it work because they would love one another in a Christ-like way, and right. it could work. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the statistics, people are still getting married, and even the cohabitators who are living together outside of marriage, the vast majority of them will say that they are doing it because they love the other person. But let me say that the emotion of love is going to wear off. Yeah. The foundation of marriage is not love. The foundation of marriage is commitment. And love grows out of that commitment. Love will flourish. It will deepen. It will bloom into something you had no idea it could bloom into. But do not expect that this emotional feeling of love is going to carry you through a lifetime of marriage. It will not.
Right. Yes, and for those who are divorced, for those who are unequally yoked in marriage, I would refer you to 1 Corinthians 7. There are some great teachings, guidelines for how Christians ought to handle those kinds of situations. We won't read it all here, but that is the place for you to look. And if you want to align yourself with God's design, then that is what you need to do. You need to act faithfully to that. Divorce, I will say that not all divorces are sinful, but I will say that there has never been a divorce where someone has not sinned that has caused that divorce to become necessary, and a lot of divorces are not necessary. Now, on your point about what was the last thing? You were talking about cohabitation?
I hit on several different things, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but we just pick one.
Well, let me just say, cohabitation, there are two things that I want to say about this. First of all, it doesn't even work. The idea behind cohabitation is, well, let's live together. Let's make sure that we're right for each other, and then we'll get married. Well, turns out people who cohabitate before they get married have a higher rate of divorce than those who don't. So there goes your theory on that. Anyway, the real issue with it is premarital sex. Now, I will say that I am aware of theologians that do not even believe that premarital sex is sinful. Now, premarital sex is not talked about explicitly so much in the Bible. What is talked about explicitly is fornication. The question is, does premarital sex fall under the umbrella of fornication? And I think it clearly does. It certainly did in Jewish culture. The marriage bed, the sheet being kept from that. Mm-hmm. Well, what that implies is, the first night a couple is married, then there is the sexual union, and if the woman is a virgin, then there would be some blood. That blood stain on the sheet of the bed would be kept by the father to have a record that man took that woman's virginity. That had to do with their culture. Obviously, that would be impossible unless she was a virgin at the time of their marriage and other such things. Now, in the New Testament, we're no longer under the Jewish law. However, I will say that you see Paul going to great pains to tell the converted Jews and the Gentiles that they do not have to abide by these certain ceremonial precepts of the Mosaic law, circumcision and food. Paul takes no such pains to free New Testament believers of the sexual laws that are...
And moral law in general.
Yes, exactly. So you want to think hard about that before you start thinking that premarital sex is not an issue.
Well, I think if anyone who seriously studies the Bible, you've pointed out a few things, but any serious student would, I believe, come to the conclusion that is against God's design. There are a number of practical reasons for this, I would say. Won't necessarily even get into all those, but it is, people give a lot of reasons for why they want to cohabitate. I have been a firm believer that the willingness to have sex outside of the marital relationship is what has fueled this, because we are designed by God as sexual creatures. That motivates us. It should motivate us to come together in marriage. It should motivate us to have a family. It should be used rightly. But like a lot of things in God's design, we have twisted it. We have abused it. We are nihilistic about it. It's all about us. We have got to move. We have got to acknowledge that and just say it like it is. You should not be doing that. You're doing it for your own pleasure, for your own self-gratification, without consideration for the other person. And people can make whatever excuse they want. They can say, well, this was just the most convenient thing to do, or this was financially advantageous, or I wanted to take a test drive, or whatever. Just make up an excuse. I would dare say if you took the sexual aspect out of it, those same excuses would not be used. That is the driving reason, because we are created as sexual beings. And so we just, as a church, we need to keep teaching that. We need to keep explaining to people what the downfalls are of that, the harm that comes from that. Pleasure is not the pinnacle of human existence. One thing when we talk about marriage as a whole, and I think one thing that contributes to this whole lack of marriage is there was a time when getting married and having a family was considered to be the pinnacle. But we have replaced that with I'm the pinnacle, me achieving something, my own pleasure, my own self-gratification. That has become the supposed pinnacle of life. And it is just so far removed from it. I've said this on the podcast before. I have had success in this life from a worldly, secular standpoint. I've had just different arenas. I've been a successful person, okay? It's not braggadocious. I'm just saying it to make a point. Nothing I have done has given me more joy, more satisfaction, more contentment than my marriage bonds and having children and now grandchildren. Even in that, there is a design, but first and foremost, that is how we achieve contentment. Again, not throwing off on those that have chosen singleness. And if you read that 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul, if you read that whole chapter, it sounds as if Paul is advocating singleness over marriage. And I'd like to discuss that a little bit in a minute, but just the general point is we've taken away the marital relationship, the family dynamic as being the ultimate in this life. And that it's really just a shame because the people who do that are missing out on so much that they could be experiencing.
Yeah, you don't want your God to be your belly, as the Bible says. What does that mean? You don't want to be ruled by your flesh, because then nothing is sacred anymore. And I think that you were mentioning earlier that a faithful reading of Scripture clearly reveals a sanction against premarital sex. Well, if you really understand the meaning of sex, then that becomes very plain. But we have no concept of the sanctity of sex or even the sanctity of our own bodies. You already said that we're not one flesh in the literal sense that, we're Siamese twins. However, when you have sex, that is no longer the case. You actually join your bodies together. And in that sense, sex is a symbol of your spiritual union together. In my mind, it is the ultimate manifestation of a marriage, and this is why it is the consummation of a marriage. And one could even make the case that sexual union outside of the bounds of legal marriage constitutes a form of spiritual marriage. And that having sex with multiple partners, whether you're married or not, constitutes a form of at least adultery, maybe even divorce in the spiritual sense. And let me just say about the whole legal thing, there's this notion that marriage is something that men invented to enslave women and to have economic possession of them. Marriage was invented by God and later formalized in human law for the purpose of societal organization. Man did not come up with marriage. There's no way that man could have come up with something so deep and so profound. So that's just a modern notion that I think has even crept into the church that is wholly wrong.
Well, let me address that for just a second, because we act as if what the government does, it has no bearing on the outcome of this measure, and that government really shouldn't even play in this. This is like a private decision. That's so backwards and so wrong, because marriage why, if you go all the way back, why did the state, the government, ever sanction it in the first place? Why did it get formalized? Because the role of government is to establish a framework in which the culture is propagated, in which we as a country of people move forward in the best possible way. And it was recognized that marriage is the way to best move a culture forward. It is a man and a woman coming together to live together, to raise a family in an intact scenario. That is the best way to propagate a country forward and for the country to have success. That is why the state says, we're going to sanction this. Mm-hmm. We're going to make a legal framework for this. We're going to make it difficult to undo this, because undoing this is not what is best for our country, for our state. And, that's really all it was an acknowledgement that this is the best way to do things. We're railing against that now. Like I said at the outset, I wouldn't be surprised if very long the state even quits recognizing marriages and just absolves that altogether, because they think, well, there's no use anymore. But that would be so tragic and so wrong, because it is the best way. If you want to just take the spiritual part out of it and look at just plain secular statistics, there's everything about two people being married and committed for the long haul creates a better result. Mm-hmm. On average, it creates a better result. Better children, better financial stability, better contentment. I mean, just pick a category. It is the best way, and people who argue against it may take some anecdotal one-off evidence and say, well, look at this particular situation. It wasn't best here, or we had a good outcome here. But applied across the whole, it is the best way. And that is why it is sanctioned by the state. The state was simply embracing God's design, which all laws should align with God's design if they're going to work properly. That's really all that the law should be.
Right. Well, see, insofar as the law is put in place to protect the health of a society, then it should reflect biblical standards.
Absolutely.
Because God does not make ordinances that destroy societies. As I've said before, his laws are beneficial. They're fruitful in the world. And make no mistake, the health of a society at large hinges on the health of its marriages. Why is that the case? Because the marriage is the smallest social unit. It couldn't be any smaller. It's two people, right? The health of the family is predicated on the health of the marriage, and you need look no farther than the statistics on divorce and fatherlessness and whatnot to see that. Then from there, the health of the community, the health of the city, state, and then at the federal level, it all comes back to those marriage relationships. If you're dissatisfied with the way that things are going in the United States, and just even in your local community, start with the marriages. That will do more for the health of your city, your state, your country than anything else.
Yeah, I've said that before, and I would stand by that statement. You want to make the world a better place, love your wife, love your husband, raise your kids under the umbrella of that love and that relationship, and the world will become a better place. It is the moving away from that has created so many of the problems we have. The church needs to be bold in standing up and unashamedly proclaiming that, because that is the truth. And that is our path forward. I mean, when I look at our society and I think, how are we going to turn this ship around? I mean, it's only through a spiritual revival, and so that's what we need to be praying for. That's what we need to be seeking God for. It's what we need to be living out in our own lives. And I do want us to go back just a little bit to the whole cohabitation thing, because I feel like we haven't necessarily addressed some of the particulars about that people may be interested in. Why is it such a bad idea? What are the things specifically, and maybe we've hit on some of these, but maybe we can go deeper on it. Why is it such a bad idea? If somebody just comes and says, okay, look, I love this person, maybe we're going to get married, maybe we're not. Different people have different views on that. They may come to you with different things, and they say, why is this not going to work? Then I think we need to give them an argument, and we need to give the church an argument to kind of say, this is what you need to be telling people. I think we've already hit very strongly on the fact, number one, this is not God's design.
Yeah.
And this is the principal reason that it will not work, is you're trying to do something here that God did not design. You're misusing something that God did not intend, and that is going to bring about poor results. You're going to enter into this without making a commitment. I think this is a big reason that cohabitation exists. There's a fear of commitment. I think some of that comes from looking at the 50% marriage divorce rate, and they think, well, I don't want to be one of those statistics. I just won't get married. Therefore, I won't be one of those. Well, if they cohabitate for a few years and then go their own separate ways, essentially they are being that same statistic. They're just not formalizing it. But my argument would be, if you go into this without the commitment, you're setting yourself up for failure. The commitment to the marriage and to the relationship that comes through going through the marriage ceremony is part of why it will work. Without that commitment, do not expect good results. It's the reason you don't need to do it. The sexual harm that comes from trying out a test drive and then going your separate ways is a problem. If you look at that point of it, just the sexual relationship inside a marriage and the help that comes from the fact that you are the only two people that have ever experienced that together brings a health to that relationship. A wife doesn't want to be compared to all your other partners that you may have had beforehand, or vice versa. You don't want in your mind to be stuck making those comparisons. That was not God's design and intent. And so, those are just some of the things I would say. I'm sure you can add to that.
Cohabitation, it's like marriage, but without the commitment. People who cohabitated, they say, well, I don't need a piece of paper to love my spouse. I don't need a big, super expensive ceremony. When I asked Courtney to marry me, and she said yes, one of the first conversations that we had about our wedding was, we have two different ways we can go here. We can have what we call a backyard wedding, or we can have a traditional wedding. We took this very seriously because this was our first major financial decision that we were going to make together. And we knew that we could go in her backyard, we could have just family, we could have a nice little ceremony and spend very little money and be married legally. Or we could do the traditional thing. We could go to a church or to a venue and invite all the people that are the most important to us and have a beautiful ceremony. We ultimately decided to go the traditional route. And the reason we decided that is because that ceremony, the crystallization of that commitment through the use of the legal documents and the witnesses of all the people that are the most important in our life, that was important. And we said, this is worth the money that it takes to make it happen. And we did spend quite a bit of money on it, much less than the national average, but the Lord blessed us with a beautiful ceremony. And the question is, well, does that affect how your marriage has gone since then? Absolutely. It has affected how our marriage has gone since then, and it will affect our marriage going forward. Looking back on that moment and saying, this was a beautiful moment that we wrote this commitment into stone. To think that you're just above all of that, that you don't need that experience, you don't need that formalization for your relationship to work, it's arrogant, and it's going to come back to bite you.
Getting married should be the major marker in our life. It is the time when we walk away from that mother and father who have raised us, and we join ourselves in every facet and dimension that really matters together with another person. There should be a ceremony that creates that marker that you can go back to. It changes your life from that day forward. It is never the same. And it should be so valued. It should be so important. It should be so held up by our churches and our society that everybody sees that value and understands that value. We have just watered it down, but it should not be that way. And I would say this to a female who chooses to live with a guy, who chooses to have sexual relationships with a guy. If you choose that before marriage, you are giving away the most valuable piece of yourself. And I'm not just talking about the singular sexual act, but I'm talking about you are giving away a part of your heart and soul that you can never get back. This is not like, I think I'm going to eat a piece of chocolate cake and it'll be over tomorrow, when I'm on a diet. No. This is an irreversible action that you are taking that you have to live with the remainder of your life. Do not take this lightly. Do not give away a piece of yourself to someone who is undeserving. And if they do not want to come to the altar and marry you and make a lifelong commitment, they're not deserving. Do not do it. And what I would say to a man who does the same thing, you are a thief and a liar. You do not love that woman. You need to give her what she is due, which is your lifelong commitment for her giving of herself to you. You need to man up and quit being so sheepish. Make a commitment, and make it before God. Make a vow before God. Make a vow before people. I can't think of a more self-serving thing than to do that as a man, because, I'm pretty practically minded. And for somebody to say, I'm really making a commitment and, I'm doing this and I'm making a commitment, but I don't want to go through the whole marriage thing. I would say you are full of it, period. I don't believe a word of it. If you want to prove that to me, get married. It's that simple, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah, and men, emotionally speaking, we have an easier time with polyamory than women do. Men are afraid to commit because they don't want to close the door on their sexual life. Look, the statistics bear this out too. You want to have a good sex life? Get married. Married people have the best sex lives of anyone in the society. Now, once you're married, there are still advances you can make in your sex life. And like I said earlier, sex is a deep thing. It's deeply symbolic. It's almost like a ritual. Every time you come together in that intimacy, reminding yourselves of the deepness of your connection. If you are married, and especially if you've been married for a long time, don't fall into the trap of saying, okay, well, yeah, I have this physical craving, like, let's just do this and I will be satisfied until the next time. Sex is so much more than that. It should be so much more than that. It should be full of passion and pleasure. The pleasure is not a mistake. God made it that way. Don't try to make it any less pleasurable than it should be. It should be full of love. And ultimately, it is it is procreative. And the removal of the procreative aspect from sex via the birth control pill back in the 50s and 60s ushered in the sexual revolution.
Absolutely.
And
that was the genesis of that. Without it, we wouldn't be where we're at today.
It's like, oh, women have so much more control over their bodies now. Once again, it's outside of the scope of this podcast, but you really need to evaluate that statement. If you think that we're better off as a society on the whole for the birth control pill and various other contraceptives and what I would call other, dare I say, perversions of the sexual act, then you need to think a little bit harder about it.
Yeah, and back to what you were saying, about sex inside of a marriage. If we are just checking a box to say, this is something I need, so let's do this, we are so missing an opportunity.
Yeah.
Because it is in that act, in that relationship, that we peak out our oneness, right? We should come together in that moment and realize that truly we are one. We are together, and we are giving of ourselves equally in such a way as to elevate the other person. And, not that sex is some kind of a self-sacrifice. That's far from removed from the truth. But there is the other person should be the focus of it. It shouldn't just be something that you're doing just to satisfy your own self.
Right.
It should be to satisfy the other. So there is on both sides an element of service in it. Some people will probably say, well, yeah, they would make a joke out of that, but we need to take that seriously.
Absolutely.
In that, and I don't know how else. I'm having trouble articulating it, but in that union is where we best recognize that we are in this together, and that we are best working together, and we are truly one.
Right.
It's when we forget that we're one is when all the trouble starts.
Absolutely.
And so that is best symbolized and shown in the sexual act.
Right. And you can forget that you're one in the sexual act, even within the bonds of marriage.
Sure.
So watch out for that. And God's design for sex is so beautiful. And I'm not just talking about the genitalia, I'm talking about the hormones that are released when you're together, though even those, the kind of emotions that they inspire in you reflect the more metaphysical reality of marriage. They are, by the way, very similar hormones to the hormones that flow through a woman's body when she's giving birth. And what does giving birth represent, metaphysically? It's the beginning of your relationship with your child. It's love. Now, love is a spiritual thing, but we also experience it physically through, like oxytocin and serotonin and whatnot. These things exist on every level. Don't think just because it's a physical thing that there's no spiritual import to it.
Absolutely.
We're running low on time here. This is so deep. I think we could probably have a podcast about just this. Not what we're about to talk about, marriage in general, but we need to talk about singleness. Paul was single, and he, in light of the present time, thought it good that other people be single as well, particularly those who have been divorced by their partners. Like, perhaps you should not remarry. Now, it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Some people have a more difficult time regulating their sexual desires than others. Now, Paul's statement is not then the destruction of everything that we have said up to this point. Christianity has, for many centuries, was kind of infatuated with celibacy. And it was as if celibacy was sort of the optimal mode of Christianity. Gary Thomas does a great job outlining this issue in his book, Sacred Marriage, if you're interested in that. And people say Jesus was celibate also. Well, that's kind of true. He took no earthly wife, but that was because he was betrothed to the church. Regardless, Paul was single. I think that once again, Wayne Grudem puts it well. A life of singleness is taking one way of honoring God and replacing it with another, right? You can honor God through your marriage, and you can honor God through celibacy. And I think that some people are absolutely called to that. And I think that that in itself can also be beautiful.
There's a practical aspect to this, and there is some belief that Paul was at one time married. We don't have any scriptural proof of that. Speculate one way or the other. The main thing that hinges on is his affiliation with the Sanhedrin and the fact that you needed to be married to be part of the Sanhedrin. So there's that. We don't know for sure. It doesn't really make a difference. But I will say this: if you read 1 Corinthians 7, read that whole chapter, Paul is advocating for singleness from a standpoint of service to God. Singleness, if we live a life of singleness, then if we choose that intentionally, it needs to be for reasons of service to God, not service to ourselves, which is what I'm hearing in the culture today is, well, I don't really want to get married because that's going to hinder my growth. That's going to hinder me. That's going to be a problem for me. I'm going to have to go visit other people's relatives, and I don't got time for that. Literally, you hear things like this. That's not the purpose. That's not why Paul was advocating for singleness. Obviously, it was that when you get married, there's a practical aspect. There is a service that is due to the husband or the wife that could be a distraction from your service to God. And so if someone makes a decision that says, I don't need that distraction because I'm so drawn into God, and they can regulate their sexual desires, as you mentioned before, then be single and honor God in that, and God bless you for it. Just many people don't have that gifting to be able to regulate that. They do need to get married. And it's not that one or the other is a lesser position. Both have their merits, and I believe God has ordained people for both circumstances. So that's my position on that. But don't feel bad either way. But if you're going to choose to be single, then do it because you are serving God and want to serve Him more. Right.
And there's another kind of singleness. It is those that are not called to celibacy. They're just not married yet. And sometimes people go a long time before they're married. There's nothing wrong with that if you're doing it for the right reasons. If you are waiting on a person who has saved themselves for you, who is pursuing God the way that you are pursuing God, who values the same thing that you value, if you're waiting for the right person, then wait as long as you need to. In this culture, people think that if you haven't had sex by the time you're 18, then you're somehow strange. Christians, pay no heed to that.
Please.
We're called to be a peculiar people. And if that means that you're peculiar sexually, then glory be to God. It is worth waiting on that person. Courtney and I, two of our mentors, they married very late in life. Part of the reason is that once they got to a certain age, they could hardly find anyone who had saved themselves. And the Lord blessed them by bringing them together. And now their marriage is a blessing to us. You can do it. Don't listen to the world. It has nothing good to tell you about these things.
Yeah, one encouraging note from the statistic we stated earlier, if you are looking for a spouse, over half the people between 25 and 34 are not married. There should be plenty of opportunities out there. But I would say this, Andrew. I think sometimes people don't get married because they think they have to wait until they reach some point in life. Now, I am an advocate of allowing yourself to mature as a person. And different people reach different points there. If you get married at 16, a lot's going to change between 16 and 24 in just how you view life. And therefore, you could wind up with an incompatible person if you marry really young, 16, 18, because you don't quite understand where you're going in life yet. But I would say here is the main thing. Find someone who is pursuing God.
Yes.
Let that be the first and foremost characteristic of your search for a spouse. There are other important factors of personality and life goals and, but oftentimes we're making our decisions based on, attractiveness and, financial resources and things like that. I can't get married until I've cleared college. I can't get married until I've got this much money in the bank.
Right.
And hey, I'm a parent. I've advocated some of those same things. But here's what I would say. If you find that person who is spiritually aligned with you and you understand and are mature enough to embrace the commitment of marriage, then you can still do those other things. Don't put that off and miss an opportunity, I would say.
Sure.
But make that spiritual connectedness the number one thing.
Yeah.
That's what's going to make marriage successful in the long run.
Yeah. Courtney and I, we graduated college 1 month and got married the next. As soon as we left our parents' house, we were together. What that means is that we're learning how to be adults together. Mm-hmm. We're not establishing a number of life rhythms solo and then trying to reconcile them with each other 10 years down the road. There's a benefit in that. And those that get married later in life, if they don't have a good reason for doing so, that can hamper them. And of course, then there's also just the purely genetic factor of limited window of fertility that has come to plague our culture and even threatens population collapse at this point because people are getting married so late in life. So as I said before, if you have a good reason, then more power to you. But if you don't have a good reason, then don't wait around unnecessarily.
Yeah, what I would say is, do not have sexual relationships before you get married as a way to relieve the tension.
Right.
And just say, because that is what drives the delay, I think, of a lot of marriages. Again, I'll call it like I see it. When I see these, 25, 26-year-old people that have been dating the same person for 6 years, I have no reason to suspect that relationship is pure because I'm a human being and I've experienced all of that myself. It is a reason to go ahead and get married, is to keep your purity and to keep God's design in that. So don't give on that issue. And if you're to the point where you feel like you're going to give on that issue, get married. Do the honorable thing and get married. Make that commitment. If you don't feel good enough about that person at that point to make that commitment, by all means, do not have sexual relations with that person.
Right.
Break up that relationship. Go a different way and find the person God's got for you.
It's better to marry than to burn with passion.
Yes.
And if that person is putting pressure on you to have sex with them before you're married, then that person is not for you.
Correct.
I think that we need to wrap up here. This is only part 1, and I think that we have had a lot of discussion about the ideal biblical marriage, about God's design, what it is and what it is not. Next time, we're going to get a little bit deeper into the particulars of marriage. We're going to be talking about, okay, we have this biblical design, but once we're inside, what happens? What are the different issues of marriage, and what are the biblical resolutions to those issues? I'll say one more thing, and then I'll let you have the last word. Ultimately, our lives are about pursuing Christ. marriage is a stepping stone to a relationship with Christ. This union, while it is of great, great importance in this world, eternally pales in comparison to the importance of our relationship with Christ. But God has so designed it that if you both pursue Christ ardently together, that will make your marriage what it should be. That's of greater importance than the compatibility of your personalities, than of your shared interests, even of your physical attraction to each other, none of which are trivial things. But pursuing Christ together, that is the way to have a healthy marriage.
As my closing word, Andrew, I would say, as I said at the outset, this is a critical issue for the church. If you are a Christian and you are married, God is calling you to live out His purposes in marriage such that you can have a healthy marriage, but beyond that, so that you can be an example to those around you that marriage does indeed work, that it is fulfilling, that it provides contentment and is just the best design for life in general, because I think people have lost confidence in that. We need those marital examples, and we need to be telling people that when we have a healthy marriage, it's not because we're a unicorn. I mean, it's because we're following God's design.
Right.
Anybody can do this if we follow God's design, and the results will be the best you can have if you do that. We've got to tell that story, because we're beyond a tipping point. We're way down the hill. We've dug ourselves a deep hole that we have got to somehow climb out of with God's help, with a spiritual revival being a part of that. So please give your marriage the attention that it needs. Live it in a biblical way. Next podcast, I invite everybody to come back. You know, if you've listened to the end of this one and you're hearing this, please come back for the next one, because what we're going to do is kind of unwrap the issues in marriage. Contrary to popular belief, everyone at your church does not have a great marriage. They have problems. You know, we're going to unpack those problems and show you how to deal with those problems in a biblical way so that you can move forward and have a healthy marriage. So come back for that. I think you'll enjoy it, and we're looking forward to sharing it with you.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this podcast. We hope it was a blessing to you. If it was, please give us a high rating or share it with a friend, and we'll see you next time. God bless you.